So the second panel will focus on the building of stronger solidarity among workers, but from the point of view of North and South. Not that it was not addressed in the first panel, but here specifically from the perspective of North and South. They will try to link together issues of migrant justice and trade justice and environmental justice, just to name a few. Now, the speakers will be addressing these issues from their location, as one of them, Kelty, Cameroon, is staff of the International Committee, let me get that straight, International Solidarity Committee of CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. They work with various workers groups around the globe, and she'll tell us their experience on that. Looking at trade agreements, so issues of trade justice and how it links to this issue of global labor migration. Our second panelist is a youth person from Youth Migrante. Migrante is a global network of migrant workers, mostly from the Philippines, and who work in different sectors of the economy. So they will try to start the conversation around what kind of strategies, not only to prevent this creation of pool of cheap labor, but also strategies of how our different sectors can work together. So that's their focus.
So, good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to share with you guys what Migrant has been doing in Canada and globally. I'm speaking actually on behalf of Chris Soria today, who's a very busy man, but I am an organizer for Migrante Canada as well. With that being said, on behalf of the 19-member organization of Migrante Canada and the 90-member organization in 22 countries, I bring to you warm and militant greetings. Over 350 migrant and refugees across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe gathered in New York on October 1st to 5th for the International Assembly for Migrants and Refugees, which is Migrante and the International Migrants Alliance, IMA, are one of the main conveners. The UNHLD claims migration can be managed as a tool for development, but what kind of development do they mean when our home countries are getting poorer and migrants are facing greater exploitation? The IAMR4 is the international grassroots level dialogue of migrants and refugees who represent the migrant people themselves. Now, for a lot of us here in this room, I believe we have a great sense as to why folks are migrating, especially from the global south. But Migrante International presents the Philippine situation as an example of how migration cannot be managed as a tool for development. Large-scale migration is a symptom of underdevelopment in the sending countries. The structural causes of the underdevelopment driving migration and exposing migrants to the vulnerable situation must be addressed. The unjust structures and the policies of governments and international institutions that impoverishes the vast majority of the world's population forces people to migrate out of the necessity and desperation, commodifying migrants and robbing them and their families of their rights and dignity perpetuates modern-day slavery for the interest of the profit and serves monopoly capitalism and not the people. Multinational corporations exploit cheap labor in poor countries, extract the natural wealth, destroy the environment, and rob present and future generation of resources to meet their needs. The US government, as the world's leading imperialist power, is the chief architect and the enforcer of the policies that continue to oppress and exploit countries in conjunction with their other imperialist countries. It is leading the world in a fascist approach to immigration laws and policies as the world's largest war and the person-based economy, most especially in the site of the US-Mexican border. Migrant workers and their family currently account for more than 90% of the total international migrant population. Active migrant workers are now about 232 million worldwide. And it comes to no surprise as the World Trade Organization is hell-bent in promoting the Migration for Development framework. Such a framework has been explored in various intergovernmental fora, exacerbating in the dependency of sending countries like the Philippines on labor export. International bodies, platforms, and financial institutions such as the World Bank and the World Trade Organization are in chorus in promoting labor export as a strategy for development rather than a social problem that needs to be resolved. The Global Forum for Migration and Development pay lip service to promote protecting migrant rights. In reality, they are primarily interested in managing migration, which means tying down migrant labor to temporary employment contracts and ensuring their safe and orderly return under the pretext of protecting domestic labor force for unfair competition. Now, how are we resisting? How are migrant communities resisting? Through the series of International Assembly of Migrants and Refugees and related initiatives as the International Migrants Tribunal, grassroots migrant workers and advocates have successfully exposed the neoliberal anti-migrant agenda expressed in the annual Global Forum on Migration and Development that the first UN high-level dialogue talks have started. We have exposed the root causes of massive forced migration, the failure of the government, the Philippine government particularly, to address the abuse and exploitation that migrants and refugees face, how this massive emigration hinders development rather than stimulates it. We also have supported the struggle of migrants who have been victims of temporary work programs like the Filipinos and the Mexican braceros in 1942 and 64. Migrants and advocates should heighten resistance to neoliberal globalization by presenting a strong voice within the international platform, and also participating in a global meeting such as what's happening right now in Bali, Indonesia, which is the World Trade Organization meeting. Speaking of the World Trade Organization, the WTO worsens forced migration for Filipino workers. The WTO promotes the Philippines' anti-migrant labor export policy. The Migration for Development framework that WTO espouses is anchored mainly on the over-reliance of the inflow of remittances to salvage otherwise a bankrupt economy. This explains the Philippine government's desperation to further seek for job markets in abroad and intensifies the labor export program. Through remittances, the government earns exponentially without having to shell out much capital investments. Aside from OFW, which is Overseas Filipino Workers Remittances, labor export also provides a tempting alternative to the unemployed and underemployed. Because of this, the government is not obliged to create jobs that offers decent wages, and instead it becomes convenient to evade responsibility of implementing policies to turn the economy around. The WTO tolerates human trafficking and coddles state-sponsored human trafficking in different parts of the world. Filipinos, mostly women and children, are being trafficked of labor and sexual trade to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and many more. The World Trade Organization opens labor market but restricts migrant rights and mobility, for immigration policies certainly have become more stringent and restrictive on migrant workers that restricts on trade. But with this being said, we do have alternatives. To genuinely address the problem of forced migration, and economic policies should focus on developing the national economy by advancing local industries, agriculture, and basic services back home. Migrant workers of the world have had a long history in resistance, not only against the WTO, but against neoliberal globalization policies that exploit and prey on the desperation of cheap labor of poor people with blatant disregard for human rights and labor rights. Migrante International fully supports the call in the struggle of the national industrialization and genuine land reform as the ultimate solution to the problem of forced migration and to end the labor export program. In organizing and conducting our campaigns in order to resist the empire, we at Migrante International recommends the following points of unity. Migration is not a tool for development. It will never be a tool for development. It's definitely a concern. It's a concern for development, in fact. We must reject the current model of migration management and instead focus on our energies and attention to securing the human rights of all migrant workers in the receiving countries and promoting sustainable development policies in sending countries which address the root causes of poverty and inequality. We must unequivocally reject the labor export policy model of sending countries such as the Philippines. Migration as a choice or an obligation for family survival should serve as a measure to see whether development goals are working. Prioritize and respect the protection and realization of human rights for migrant workers. Migrant rights are human rights. Too often, human rights are limited to citizen rights, and migrant workers are excluded on the basis of their nationality. Migrant workers provide essential social services in their countries of work and do the jobs that no one else is willing to do. They contribute to their communities at home and abroad as their rights as important as any others. Government should prioritize the respect, realization, and protection of migrant workers in their right to the UN Convention on Protection of Migrants and their members of their family. Number 3, introduce democratic participation in governmental and intergovernmental policy and making process. Migrant workers' voices are being ignored and suppressed, while their earnings in their form of remittances are being eyed by the governments. Democratic and transparent processes must be introduced in all government process, from the local, the regional, to the international, in both sending and receiving countries. And lastly, the United Nations High-Level Dialogue Talk, which seems to be the expert in migration these days, should open their forum to the grassroots migrant organization and not merely tokens of them. Lessons can be learned from the ILO structure, which has representation from workers and trade unions. Grassroots migrants, refugees, and advocates will continue to resist the neoliberal globalization framework on migration and development. We will work towards the goal of making migration and development a genuine exercise of the people's right that is only possible under a system that is just, equitable, and democratic. Thank you. Oh, sorry, by the way, speaking of the conference that was in New York, I do have copies of the resolution of the meeting, so for folks who are interested, we do have some copies. I can hand them in as well. The notes.
So hi everyone. Thank you for asking me to participate and for all of you for being here. As Jojo mentioned, my name is Kelty Cameron. I'm the International Solidarity Officer for CUPE National, and CUPE is a member of Common Frontiers, which is a multi-sectoral coalition that really grew out of the free trade, the resistance to free trade and the NAFTA struggles, and focuses primarily on economic and environmental and social justice in the Americas. And I also want to acknowledge the migrant workers who are here in the room today and recognize your courageous struggles, and also to say that we very much want to act in solidarity with your struggles. So I'm really looking forward to having a discussion after this panel, because I'm really grappling with a lot of these issues and how to be concrete and how to actually stop talking about things and actually make things happen on the ground. And it's a big challenge coming from I'm in the ivory tower of the union, the labor, and the national office. So I was asked to speak about the challenges and strategies for international solidarity with migrant justice movements, and after hearing the comrade here speak, our starting point when we talk about genuine international solidarity absolutely must include the struggle of migrants and must confront the conditions and the policies, both local and global, that create the conditions that force people to become commodities and force people to leave their countries in search of employment. And when we think about international solidarity, we're talking about, and we're struggling for ways to address poverty and unemployment and land grabbing and foreign corporate intervention and military intervention, or the impacts of these in different countries. But really, what I think our challenge is to really hear from and consult and to listen to the people that are the most affected by these struggles, and who continue to be super exploited in this process. From a trade union perspective, I think the heart of that solidarity within the trade union movement and also the Trade Justice Network is to see ourselves as part of a broader labor, a broader working class, and not just in service to the narrow membership that is part of the unions. And I think that is a big struggle. And Herman discussed a lot of the challenges earlier today about, and the impact of divide and rule on the shop floor, and whether foreign migration is considered an opportunity or a competition workers in terms of building solidarity, the perception of threats to our jobs, and the lack of political campaigns that are being taken up, and a focus on organizing in numbers only, and sort of losing that kind of genuine solidarity, and really just thinking a lack of vision in terms of challenging capital. There's a couple challenges I think that are worth mentioning to be a bit concrete about the work in the trade union movement, and how we've worked with Common Frontiers and Coalition around resisting international trade. And I think a lot of times international solidarity, particularly in the labor movement, can be really separated from the actual work of the union that they take on a day-to-day basis. So on the one hand, it's sort of siloed. We'll talk about international struggles in terms of some of the projects that we have or some of the work we do, but we don't necessarily see it as the integral part of absolutely everything that takes place in the union, including collective bargaining and also education and organizing, of course. But I do think that is changing, and I think that there is an opportunity and a space to move that issue forward. I think at times, a lot of the work can be a little bit like an NGO, and we focus on projects, and it really is separated from the conditions of workers here and abroad. And so, we may be trying to mitigate the impact of capitalism, but we're really not necessarily trying to build the work that we're doing with a vision of confronting capitalism and really making the linkages between the organizations that we may work with, but also and the unions that we're working with, and with the people most affected on the ground. And oftentimes, I think with the labor movement, we often see that they'll rely or work primarily with global union federations or other unions, which is not an inherent problem, but it is a reality that when the majority of migrant workers are being organized outside of the formal trade union structures and the institutions of labor, that becomes a really big consideration, and particularly some of the stuff that took place at the United Nations recently, where you had the International Assembly of Migrants, which is a global formation of migrant workers convening to challenge this development agenda. And that's not something that, I think that was something that we could have taken up in a much more meaningful way. But again, I think that there are opportunities I think some of that is changing. There's spaces and more discussion happening where we can challenge the lack of participation of unions in these spaces. And I think that for unions to take up these struggles and to really genuinely work in solidarity with migrant organizers and migrant workers in this country really does, it requires a complete reorientation, or at least a partial orientation of strategies, but it also really begins to bring us towards what is necessary, and that is a working class based solidarity movement. And that includes, I hear, broadening the calls around universal access to, CPP or doubling the CPP, or access to EI. That also needs to include, issues of status and issues of mobility rights for migrants. And that's not something that we necessarily hear in the same, sentence or call. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that we face, and this is what I'm really grappling with, and I hope we can have a conversation about this, is to connect what's happening locally, the local conditions. Well, when we talk about international solidarity, it's always about connecting the local with the global. I mean, that's a cliche, that's something we say, but really in practice, what does that mean? In terms of how do we actually raise the consciousness of, from a trade union perspective, the consciousness of members in the process. And, you know, I think that we can say that we're supporting migrant workers' struggles by letter of solidarity or some money, but that's not the genuine solidarity and working class solidarity that's necessary. And I think that part of what the issues are is there is a lot of anti-migrant sentiment on the shop floors. There are a lot of workers who are struggling and who are feeling their jobs being threatened. But that's also an opportunity with the proper education and organizing to have a discussion about capitalism and have a discussion about how that intersects with the tools that are used, that being racism but we also have, you know, a lot of migration from east to west in this country. And Lorraine's point, I was going to raise that, is that, you know, we have our own internal migration process taking place in this country. So how do we make that link with what's happening on the ground and what's happening crossing borders in this country? And I think that that's really where I like to try to focus my attention in terms of building international solidarity, is actually making the connections around, you know, the changes in the labor market, the decline of the fisheries in the East Coast, and access to EI that is forcing migrants west. And I think that does require quite a bit of local strategy and education and organizing, and I think it's starting to happen a little bit, and I'm optimistic that will continue. But I think that the issue of forced migration really is an issue to also bring the issue of international, or the actions of international solidarity home, in terms of challenging our own government's complicity in not only their repressive policies here in terms of the lack of rights in temporary foreign worker program, for example, the seasonal agriculture, the living caregiver program, the lack of access to services and support, and the right to organize, but also in terms of our Canadian government's actions abroad and their increasing imperialist aggressive tendencies in military, you know, aggression, and how they are signing trade agreements with Colombia, and how they're signing trade agreements with Honduras, and signing military procurement agreements at the same time. And anecdotally, I was in Colombia and was hearing that there are supposed to be more Colombian workers coming into Canada. Now, I don't know, but that was something that I was hearing. And there's a direct connection between the conditions that are created under these free trade agreements that Canada is signing and an influx of workers that are being forced to migrate here. And these are some of the things that I think that we are needing to take up and challenge our own government and make those links in that way. I'm not going to speak much more. I guess I just want to end because I think that there is a real opportunity, as repressive a time as we're in, and how dire and how difficult the situation is for migrants. I think that the union movement, partially in their own self-interest and partially maybe not, you know, when there was an announcement that 15% the wages for temporary foreign workers were going to be 15% lower, it was a bit of an aha moment which migrants and migrant worker advocates have been saying for years, that this affects all of us. I think that was a concrete example of how people really started to, the labor movement said, okay, wait a second, this is really going to drive down wages for all of us, and we've got to take this on. And I think they are taking it on. So now there is a genuine space for migrants and advocates to actually enter. I think the challenge is how does that happen, and how do we create that in a genuine way, and also through the struggles around the trade agreements and the free trade, like through Common Frontiers. I think there's a lot of work happening around these trade agreements. They are creating the conditions of forced migration, and I think as we challenge that in Canada, I think that there's a lot more we can be doing. to and need to be doing to bring the voices of migrants and the most impacted into those struggles. So I'll stop there.